Tara remembers the day child protection officers knocked on the door of the house where she was living with a man 11 years her senior. We had concocted a story, preempting this very situation, and I lied to them about what was happening, she says. At 14, Tara was living with a predator that had groomed me and was keeping me, as he said, as his wife, under God. Her mother was in long-term psychiatric care, her father had moved out with a new girlfriend. Tara experienced persistent psychological, physical and sexual abuse. She was also addicted to drugs, supplied by her abuser, who was recently sentenced to almost a decade in jail. Tara has since recovered, and is cautiously backing a Victorian proposal for mandatory residential drug treatment for drug and alcohol-addicted children. I was in a situation in which I was getting abused and I was being fed drugs. I desperately needed to have a connection to a community outside of that exploitative, manipulative, toxic, abusive place, she says. So it would have just made a massive difference in my life, if the Department of Human Services, when they came over, had taken me away. I'm watching my son die before my eyes. The idea of mandatory rehabilitation. Substance-addicted youth is currently being debated in Tara's home state of Victoria, and also in South Australia, where a proposal is before state parliament. In Victoria, the case for rehabilitation is spearheaded by Jennifer Bowles, a children's court magistrate. She says she sees children with significant substance abuse issues every day at court, but one boy in particular spurred her into action. A heavy cannabis user, Greg came before Magistrate Bowles when he was 17 for stealing bottles of highly alcoholic vanilla essence from supermarkets. Because he continually reoffended, he ended up in custody, Magistrate Bowles says. In custody, Greg was assaulted. It was Greg's mother's words in court that stuck with Magistrate Bowles. She was so concerned about her son's health. She said to me, "What can you do? I'm watching my son die before my eyes," she says. While not critical of the voluntary treatment regimes currently in place in Victoria, Magistrate Bowles says some young people are so damaged and so vulnerable that they don't engage with those programs, and therefore don't receive any treatment. She says children's courts should be given the power to make orders for mandatory residential drug treatment. I feel like as a community we have an obligation to intervene as early as possible to help these young people, she says. On a Churchill Fellowship, Magistrate Bowles visited Sweden, Scotland, England and New Zealand to see firsthand how secure homes and therapeutic community residences work there. She's now trying to convince the Victorian government to consider mandatory treatment for heavy substance abuse. This would apply in circumstances where the child has had a chance to engage in voluntary treatment first and for whatever reason they couldn't or wouldn't engage. The evidence we heard overseas was that it would take 4 to 6 months to effect change, in some cases longer, Magistrate Bowles says. Balancing civil liberties, Magistrate Bowles acknowledges some criticisms of such an approach, particularly around mandatory detention of members of the indigenous community. We look at the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. There is a real concern about detaining Aboriginal people and young people included, of course, she says. But she says when she sits in the Children's Quarry Court, elders will say to me, "We must be able to do something better." We need to have community on board, she says. We need to have it as close as possible to the country from which the young people are from, and for elders to have a key responsibility in assisting to reconnect a lot of these lost children to their culture. Magistrate Bowles also maintains a successful facility would focus on a health and welfare response rather than punitive justice. It's not bars on the windows, it's not concrete walls, she says. It's examples that I saw overseas, where it can be homely and welcoming and respectful in a medical clinical model. Aside from detoxing, participants would receive therapeutic help from clinicians, and progress reports would be provided back to the court. As they progressed, the young person would move from a secure facility to a residential one. With the same clinicians working through with the young person from the secure facility to the residential facility, and as I saw in every country I visited, education and training facilities on site, Magistrate Bowles explains. How is this different to South Australia's model? In South Australia, the state government has a 9-page mandatory treatment bill before Parliament. Penny Wright, the state's guardian for children and young people, is cautiously reviewing the proposal. The government's proposing that the youth court in South Australia can make orders to compel a child or young person to undergo mandatory treatment for a drug dependency, she explains. The proposed legislation mandates detention for compulsory treatment for up to 12 months for drug-addicted children, excluding alcohol addiction. There are very few human rights protections in that bill, Ms. Wright says. She's concerned about what she sees as an absence of a model of care in the proposal. What should be the linchpin of a system of compulsory treatment for drug dependency, is just not there in the bill, she says. Basically, it's like the government asking the Parliament to sign a blank check. They are saying pass this bill to enable the detention of young people, as young as 10 for a period of up to 12 months, and then we'll come up with a place for them to go and the treatment they will receive once it's passed. While Ms. Wright praises the welcoming and therapeutic nature of the treatment regime proposed by Magistrate Bowles in Victoria, she maintains that mandatory detention should be a last resort. My view is that if young people could get effective help and treatment when they first need it, then it's certainly arguable that there'd be less need for a mandatory system like South Australia's proposal, at the end of that time, because dependency becomes more entrenched, not less entrenched over time, she says. She understands the South Australian government is currently considering some further amendments. I've also heard they're developing a model of care now, Ms. Wright says. But she's still concerned about the level of community consultation in South Australia on the issue. Finding a path forward in Victoria, Magistrate Bowles has built a broad support base for a secure therapeutic facility, drawing on advice and consultation from experts, practitioners and state service providers. This is an opportunity for these young people to deal with the underlying reasons for why they're using and also to meaningfully engage in education and training, she says. And then ultimately there would need to be a very planned transition back to the community. The South Australian bill, as it stands, doesn't account for such a transition. However, the state's Minister for Health and Wellbeing has told the Office of the Guardian for Children and Young People that the department will talk with stakeholders to inform the government's approach to develop, implement and evaluate a youth treatment orders model, which could include considerations around transition. Ms. Wright says just returning children without any support would possibly be setting them up to fail. It's a sentiment that's echoed by Tara. I would like to see the young people being supported back into the community, and also developing connections within their community. That's the important thing to me, she says. It's not just the absence of doing drugs, that's not the major issue in young people's lives, the major issue is the isolation, the disadvantage and the marginalization. It would have to be done very carefully, with a lot of transparency and oversight. More stories from Victoria.